We have babka, and we had some for all of you, but we'll leave it here. For those of you around the corner, you can come and get your babka.
It's an incentive for you to come join us.
We thought of mailing it to you all, but we're not sure if it would work. We're mailing babka. Mail-in babka for
3 weeks.
open babka.
It's over 100 miles away.
It's open book, open babka.
Open babka.
Open babka. Thank you.
So, Shabbat Shalom. We have, it's not an easy parsha this week. We're going to get into it in a couple of minutes. There's a lot of exportation. We're going to dive into some exportation and see what meaning we make out of it. And then some really interesting chassidut, mystical stuff, and even some poetry. So, who would like to recite the bracha today? Grace, could you screen share the bracha? Eden, do you want to say the bracha? Sure.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav, v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
So blessed are you, source of the universe, who has commanded us to soak in your ancient wisdom. I think that was the Rabbi Jessica Kate Meyer invention. Soak. Okay, so we're in Parshat Ekev, and this is the second Shabbat of Consolation, right? There are 7 Shabbatot of Consolation after the holiday, so to speak, of Tisha B'Av, the ninth of Av, the day of mourning and fasting, and we're in the midst of Moshe's long speeches to the Israelites, right? This is the new generation as they're poised to go into the promised land, and asking them to remember. We were just talking about this, what they actually didn't live through. Right? Remember. So let's see what they're supposed to remember in this particular section of the speech in Parshat Ekev. Want to say anything else, Rabbi David, by way of introduction?
I just need Grace, if you can give me screen sharing capacity on my computer, that'd be great, so I can share the text. No, I think that you captured. I think you'll see it when we share the text that there's one of the things about environment, I think in general, that we were talking about earlier, is that the construction of the text, in other places of the Torah, the construction of the text also lends itself to what are called light words. That was a term that was coined by Rosenzweig, Huber and Rosenzweig, when they were writing their translation, the German translation of the Bible. They said there's certain words that are light words. There are words that that appear as frequently and are almost like a neon light, saying like, "Here, look at me," and the theme will be produced by the repetition of that word or those series of words in a given text. And one of the things about Dvarim, which is remarkable in almost every parsha, is that, especially in the first couple here, like Dvarim, Hanan, Ekev, or is that words repeat themselves so clearly, and so intentionally, and with such, there's also the rhythm of it and the reading of it.
Yeah,
so
it feels almost mantra-like,
it's
as we discussed yesterday.
It's like a lyric. It's lyrical. You'll see that we tried to color code some of the words just to point out their light wordness.
I actually added some since we studied yesterday. New colors.
Love it. All right. Oh, the Shabbos here. Okay, we have a lot of friends here. Okay, wonderful. Let's see. Here's the.
So people in the room, you can't see the colors on your page. They should pop up on the screen.
Oh, or they got lost. No, they didn't show up. No.
All right, we'll just name the words.
Darn.
All that work for nothing.
I know.
They are on the link with the text shows the color.
Oh, and the link there. Interesting.
Perhaps you could screen share off the internet rather than off the PDF.
So many technicians. I was thinking exactly the same thing. I'm telling you. Thank you.
Just hit the link in the chat.
Just for the sake of the colors. I love it. go to the chat.
Paul's very happy with his vodka.
A light word or light motif, exactly.
I'm thinking.
Wonderful. Lots of comments.
Graceful.
German opera. Love it.
The German one.
Roberta pointed out that a light motif also from opera.
Ah, right.
Let's see. If the link.
Yes.
Indeed.
There are the brilliant colors.
Oh, great.
You're not kidding. Wow.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Let's just get the screen grab.
It's like a rainbow text.
Oh, technology.
There we go.
Ah. Right. Good job. Okay,
It's like
great.
getting to Oz.
I added the red this morning just
The
to.
red. I love the red. I'm loving the red.
Do the different colors have different meanings?
The colors don't have meanings, but the
Source. These things are usually done ahead of time, but okay.
here we are.
Okay, great.
We're good.
Source number one.
Watching the wizard for the believers.
Yes, exactly. There we go.
Okay.
כל המצוות אשר אנוכי מצווך היום תשמרון לעשות למען תחיון. So all these mitzvot, these commandments that I am commanding you on this day, Hayom is also another leitmotif in the book of Deuteronomy. Tishmarun, you shall guard, you shall watch over. La'asot, to do. Why? Lema'an tichyun, so that you shall live. Uvitem, and you shall multiply. Uvatem, v'yirishtem et haaretz. You shall come and you shall inherit the land Asher nishba Adonai la'avotechem, that God promised your ancestors. So I'm just noticing the shift from Anochi, from God saying I, to God being described in the third person. Right, so the beginning of the verse is I, God's voice, and at the end, or is it Moshe's voice?
It's Moshe's voice.
Oh, you're right. You're right.
No, but this is where Shabbos. So this is where the Zohar says the radical thing that Moshe was speaking, that God was speaking through Moshe's voice.
Right, God, right. Moshe is channeling that Anochi feels like God's voice.
Right.
Right.
Anochi.
Okay. Yeah, because it'd be interesting to see when Moshe speaks in Moshe's voice, if Moshe uses Anochi, which I think he doesn't. I think he uses Ani. Okay, so we'll go on.
That's really good.
The Zacharta, it's called Haderech. You should remember the whole way, the whole path, Asher Holichacha Adonai, that God made you walk, right? And it's interesting. It's very like positive, right? God is walking us, almost like we walk a dog. Asher Holichacha Adonai Elohecha, your God. Zeh 40 shana b'midbar. This 40 years in the desert. Why? So why did God make you walk through the desert for 40 years, or cause you to walk through the desert for 40 years? L'ma'an anotcha, to make you suffer. Inui is something we have on Yom Kippur, right? That certain kinds of suffering or deprivations. L'nasotcha, to test you. L'dat asher bilvavecha, to know what is, and I think so God should know what's in your heart. Hatishmor mitzvotav imla. Are you going to observe God's commandments or not? Right. So a long 40-year test. Right. And this is the part that it's kind of disturbing. Right. A 40-year test, 40 years suffering.
Did we pass? I mean, it's like amazing. Like if that was a test, we failed. We failed.
Yeah. Although we passed over into the promised land, so I guess it took 40 years to pass.
40 years to pass the
It's a
test.
long exam.
Okay.
Do you ever have those dreams where you miss the exam or you're late for the exam, right?
Yeah.
It's a 40-year exam, the dream of a 40-year
It's a
exam.
never-ending exam.
Yeah.
Very Kafkaesque.
Yes, all right, so verse 3. Vaye'ancha. So again, that the verb that indicates suffering, right?
See, there are too many repetitions for us to actually,
Yeah,
It's
there are
like-
too many.
Anotcha, Vaye'ancha, right?
Right, but we did indicate the theme of feeding or being fed or eating throughout
Yes,
the passage in
Vaye'ancha,
green,
exactly.
right? And knowing and
Is in
not
yellow.
knowing, right? Knowing, not knowing.
Like the whole notion of knowledge and
Yeah,
what is to be known and how to know it. And
yeah, and lechem, of course. Okay. V'yancha v'yar'ilecha v'ya'achilcha. So God subjected you to hardships and made you hungry and fed you. That's Haman, right? So the manna, asher lo yadata v'lo yad'un avotecha, that you didn't know, and also your ancestors didn't know. Laman, why?
so that you would know.
Laman, so that you would know. Laman hodi acha, to let you know. Kilo, and this is a very famous phrase. Kilo al halechem levado yichyeh adam, that it's not by bread alone that people live or survive, but by what? Ki al kol motza pi Adonai yichyeh adam. That everything comes from God's mouth. That is what enlivens human beings.
And so you see also a repetition here of the word chiyut, which also appeared earlier, aliveness, right? It repeats itself twice in this verse. It appeared itself already earlier. Laman tichyun in the first pasuk, in the first verse, and also just to note here that pretty radically in the verse about bread, we have the word motza, motzi.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, pretty amazing, right?
But hamotzi lechem
aretz, but here it's like hamotzi, right? What the things that come out of God's mouth, or things that come out of the earth, which also has a mouth, right? The earth has a mouth, pi haaretz. So the earth gives forth its nourishment, and God, as the earth or as the land in which we live, also produces nourishment for us, but it's not bread, but by speech or by our aliveness, right? Right.
Well, there's a really interesting distinction here, theologically. Like, what's wrong with bread and why is manna better? Like, what does manna teach us, right? And it reminds us, I was saying to my chabritza this morning, so there's something about bread, like, farmers work the land and draw, wheat from the ground through amazingly hard work, and then we need bread and we ultimately eat. So there's a lot of human effort. Manna comes directly from the heavens, right? So that's what we're trying to learn in this passage. The Torah is imparting this notion that it doesn't come from human effort alone, but from what God gives us. And it reminds the Syrian Jews on Friday night, when we say hamotzi, when we make the bread over the challah, we actually throw it to each other instead of hand it to each other, so that we understand that bread comes from the heavens.
That's why.
Yes.
That's
You didn't know?
I knew about the throwing, which I
So we're like tossing bread,
more
right?
I thought it was like more sweet, just throw it. It's like
It's tossing bread all over the
it's
table.
less formal. You just like throw it.
No. It's very distinct. It's a theological move. It's a theological move. What?
It's a theological. Yeah, it could be a food fight, but it's a. Wow, that's
It's a theological throw.
I love it. You're thrown theologically thrown. I like it.
Okay.
It's very Kierkegaard.
But that's what manna is, right? You know that manna is a
Right.
kol motzah pi Adonai.
Right.
That it's from God's mouth that we receive manna.
Right. And so that becomes, and like I'm just noting also, people might be chatting here, just this becomes we have a light board, we also have a light theme here, obviously, a light motif, as Roberta pointed out, which is indebtedness. The notion of being that gratitude is rooted in a sense of gifted, like the gift that we can't ever fully repay kind of thing. And that how do we educate? Moshe is the great pedagogue. He's trying to educate us, whether he's successful or not is a good question, on what it means to reframe your success or achievements or the things that you would normally own for yourself that really have been gifted by you.
So it's the overwhelming gift, and it's also interpreting overwhelming dependence. Like, no matter how much our society teaches us that we are not dependent, right? We are so radically dependent. Right? That's the truth we don't want to remember.
Right.
right? That's what we want to forget. It was so radically different. It's frightening, it's terrifying.
No.
Okay.
Let's try to make it the end of this because there's a lot, and then I feel like there's
Okay,
also.
can I
and
ask
these are
Asher
like-
Chaim to read? I'm gonna ask Asher Chaim to read. Go ahead, I'm sorry, what did you say?
No, beautiful. Asher Chaim.
I like Asher Chaim.
Where am I?
You're in verse 4. Simnatcha lo valta me'alecha.
Shall I do Hebrew and English, or just the Hebrew and?
Yeah, Hebrew English is great.
Hebrew
please.
English, yeah.
Simlatcha lo valta me'alecha viraglecha lo vasecha ze 40 shana. Your garment did not wear out from on top of you, nor did your raglecha lo vasecha, sorry, nor did your feet swell. For these 40 years. V'yada'ata im levavecha ki ka'asher yiyaser ish et beno Adonai Elohecha miyassereka. And you will know deep in your heart that just as a parent disciplines his child, so Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, your God, is disciplining you. V'shamarta et mizvot Adonai Elohecha lalechet b'derachav u'liyir'a oto. You shall observe the mitzvot of Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, your God, to walk in God's paths and to yir'ah, revere, fear, awe, respect God. Ki Adonai Elohecha mevi'acha el eres tova, eres nachalei mayim, ayanot utahomot yos'im babiq'a uvahar. Because Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, your God, is bringing you to a good land, a land of flowing, of streams of water, springs and fountains issuing from the flatlands and the hills. Eres hikka useora v'gefen ute'ena. Sorry?
Go ahead, sing it for us. You should sing it for us.
I don't know the melody. Please, Rav.
Oh. Right. Eretz chitam useora v'gefen ute'ena v'rimon v'gefen ute'ena v'rimon Eretz Zet shemen udvash, right? Zet shemen udvash. Thank you for that. Go ahead, Asher.
A land of wheat, barley, vines, figs, pomegranates, a land of olive trees and honey. Eres asher lo v'miskenut tochal bach lechem, lo tehsar kol bach. Eres asher avaneha barzel u'meharareha tahsov nehoshet. A land where you will eat food without danger. You will not lack anything in the land, a land with stones that yield metal and from whose hills you can mine copper. V'yachalta v'savata uverachta et Adonai Elohecha al ha'aretz hatova asher natan lach. You shall eat, you will be satisfied, you shall bless Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, your God, about the good land that God has given you. Hishamer lecha, pen tishkach et Adonai Elohecha levilti shmor misvotav u'mishpatav v'chukotav asher anochi metzavecha hayom. Watch out, lest you forget Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, your God, and not observe commandments and statutes and rulings which I command you today. Pen tochal v'savata, uvatim tovim tivne v'yashavta. Lest you eat and are sated and build beautiful houses and dwell in them. Uvkarcha v'tzoncha yirbiyun v'chesef v'zahav yirbelach v'chol asher lach lecha yirbeh, and your large animals and your small animals will multiply, and gold and silver and gold will multiply for you, and everything that you have increases. V'ram levavecha v'shachachta et Adonai Elohecha hamosiacha me'eretz Mitzrayim mibeit avadim. And your heart mind grows haughty, and you shall forget Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, your God, who brings you out of the land of Mitzrayim, the place of slavery. Wow, v'shachachta is like the imperative there. I just noticed that. Hamolichecha bamidbar hagadol v'hanora nahash saraf ve'akrav v'simmaon asher ein mayim hamosi lecha mayim mitzura halamish. The one who has caused you to walk through this great fearsome wilderness with snakes and scorpions and other ones like that, and thirst where there's no water, the one who brought you water from flinty rock. Hamahalchilecha man bamidbar asher lo yad'un avotecha lema'an anotecha ulema'an nasotecha lepivacha ba'acharitecha. The one who fed you manna in the wilderness, which you didn't know, which your ancestors didn't know, in order to discipline, chastise you, and to test you so that it would be good for you in the long run. V'amarta b'levavecha kochi v'otzem yadi asa li et ha'chayil hazeh. And you say in your heart mind, my own strength and the force of my arm created all of this wonderful stuff. Zacharta et Adonai Elohecha ki hu hanoten lecha koach la'asot hayil lema'an hakim et brito asher nishba' la'avotecha kayom hazeh. And you shall say in your heart mind, and you shall remember Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, your God, because it is God who gives you strength to do great things in order to establish the covenant which was sworn to your ancestors as this day. How far am I reading here?
2 more verses and we're done.
והיה אם שכוח תשכח את אדוני אלוהיך והלכת אחרי אלוהים אחרים ועבדתם והשתחווית להם העדותי בכם היום כי עבוד תאבדון. If you forget Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, your God, and walk after other gods and worship them and bow down to them, I testify against you today that you will truly perish. Kagoyim asher Adonai ma'avid mipnechem, kein tovedun, ekev lo tishme'un b'kol Adonai Elohechem. Like those nations that Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh is wasting away before you, so shall you be lost, because you did not listen to the voice of Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, your God.
Thank you.
Thank you. So just Yashakov, really beautiful reading. Just a note at the last verse, we just did 20 verses, and just a couple of things to note just before we move into opening it up and maybe looking at some other texts. Just to notice also that it's almost as if the text doesn't really need much commentary. It's pretty clear in its warnings and what it wants and what it's relaying. It uses these repetitions of words to underscore themes of knowing and not knowing, of leaving slavery and leaving bondage and forgetting and remembering and being tested and succeed, like all of these things. But one of the beautiful things here is that it ends with this verse, Ekev lo tishme'un, as a result of, or the word Ekev, as we talked about last night, Ekev meaning heel, as a result of, or as a consequence of not listening or obeying God's voice, all of these things will occur. And it's an ending of where the Torah portion this morning begins with, Vaya Ekev tishme'un, right? If you will, Ekev, listen. If you will, as a result of your listening, these wonderful things will happen. And if you will not listen or obey or heed these warnings, then these are the things that will exile and so on, all these pieces. But one of the things that we discuss here is that there's also there's some tension in these texts, because remembrance and what we're to remember is that we are dependent, and what we often forget is that we're dependent. And in life, though, it doesn't quite look that way all the time, that where you remember and remembering is a good thing, and forgetting is a bad thing. It's kind of a little bit more of a mixed bag. It's a little bit more different, but we'll hold off on that for a second.
Yeah, I just want to say one thing,
Yeah.
which is, I think there's something about this text that names a very young experience. You know, the God who leads us through, walks us through the desert, the God who feeds us, right? Like where food comes from. And I'm wondering if it's sort of recapturing, making sense of sort of like that almost infantile experience, you know, and our deep ambivalence about dependence, and especially early dependence. And depending on the parenting experience we have, that could be a deeply negative experience that depends, or wonderful, like you feel like you're always being blessed and gifted. It's
Right.
just so powerful.
It complicates achievement, and it complicates like the warnings against self-assertion or self-confidence on the one hand. But if that's laden with all kinds of judgment around actually achieving, and one never feels fully like one can achieve. I think it was Eric Erickson in his psychosocial development had autonomy versus shame and doubt as an early fulcrum of psychosocial development of children, like where you're trying to establish your own, as you would, power, right? Your own space, your own power. And that is kind of tinged with a sense of shame, right? Or you know, timidity, doubt, like, can I go forward? And that this kind of plays with that, because here, human beings, like it's clear that human beings can certainly experience kochidot and yadi. Like I did it. I'm a self-made person, or whatever it might be. It was my power, did it. And there's the other side of that, which is feeling that you can't take credit for anything, and you can't feel confident in anything you do.
Yeah.
And that's certainly two extreme postures, for sure. I wonder.
Yeah, let's see.
Rabbi Dan, does that connect to, I think it was 2 weeks ago,
Yeah.
we talked about the roots of each root about suckling and
Yeah, so we were talking about emunah, faith, which also relates to the word for a guardian, an omen, and even the word for suckling. So there's something about faith, which is a willingness to be dependent on God, right? And to sort of receive that influx of divine energy, so to speak.
We're gonna, if anybody wants to add, just raise your hands, and we'll find that. I know in the room, we'll go with Elliot.
Yeah, so what I sort of notice here is just the emphasis on heeding, right? And I keep coming back to the Shema, right?
Yeah.
Which is like that's it. Right? This is our central prayer: Shema, heed, listen, understand.
And that verb is all over Deuteronomy,
right?
Again and again.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. And so I guess my question is, what are we being asked to heed? And so, if you take the more sort of literal, traditional, orthodox interpretation of what we're being asked to heed, and then a more reform, renewal, what is it, rabbis, okay, that we're being asked to heed?
Ooh.
You want to do the Orthodox, or I'll do the Orthodox, or we can just divide denominationally. And I don't know necessarily that it's like it's always.
I'll tell you what comes to me the first thing. I don't know. You'll decide what camp you're going to put this comment into. But to me, like the Torah is a book of instructions of life. It's not necessarily the discrete God who's saying, here are my instructions and you better. I mean, that's not the way I read the Torah, but it's like, here are deep truths about life. And also this relates to the environment, and you pay attention, and you observe them, and you guard them, and you keep them sacred. Otherwise, you're in trouble, which is basically true. Mm-hmm. So that's what I would say. Like, are you really listening? Are you listening? Or are you cut off?
So yeah,
that's kind of renewal, right?
Yeah, no, I would say that all of these perspectives are part of like the civilization of Jewish, like the answer from Jewish civilization would be incorporate a lot of these answers. And I think I wouldn't say denominationally, I think it was more, the Torah on its own terms is very clear that the Torah itself is the blueprint, and observing the Torah itself will lead to what it sees as the promised land, or the fulfilled life, or the well-lived life. it also warns us against, right, forgetting about the mitzvot and forgetting about the things that are in the Torah. And certainly the rabbis also have a very similar opinion, but they expand it to include the duties of the heart, which are implicit here, right? B'chol levavcha, with all of your heart, in the Shema, with all of your, all of your energies. It's implicit. The internal is implicit in the Torah, but it's made explicit in the rabbinic literature. And then I think the fuller evolution of our literature would invite what Rabbi Florescus was saying, which is to be alive and awake to the warnings of the Torah and spiritual literature writ large are warning us about, kind of not all the same literature. It's not saying the same thing, but it's kind of in one large, like human capacity for self-destruction and other destruction, human capacity for selfishness and for grabbing and owning and forgetting and all those, dire warnings that are kind of part of what we're to remember. And then to build a society around that. Like that's kind of like the Torah's more broadly. I think the renewal Jews would put an emphasis more on the internal and less on the behavioral slightly, and ritualistic, but still, I mean, personally, I would say it's all part of one commitment, which is to be a committed Jew, is to be committed to the system of Judaism, and to be a committed Jew is also to be dedicated to the spiritual life, which is bigger than even Judaism itself, but not less than.
Being committed to the system of Judaism, and the Torah makes it very clear, so that you shall live.
Right.
You shall be alive.
Alive, awake, alive. And I think that the heeding part is a great thing, because I think that if you look in Buddhist literature in particular, there's a lot of heeding that goes on. Bhikkhus heed, students remember, right? Practice. Anyway, that's, I guess, good question from Elliot. We'll take someone in that. We'll go to I think that Daniel Berlin had his hand up, and then we can go back to the room. So, Daniel.
Good Shabbos, good morning. I really appreciate this notion of light orbs or light motifs, and one of your comments, David, about the bookends of listening and Akev at the beginning and listening, Kol Hashem at the end of this chapter 8. And there seems to be an echo of probably one of the most important moments in Torah. It's the same language where Abraham, after he hears the voice that says, Abraham, don't sacrifice Isaac. And then after that, angel or messenger says that you are going to be rewarded, Akev, because you listened to the voice. There's like a repeat of that Akedah moment for Abraham's listening and the rewards that come from that. It seems like there's a light orb that's traveling over here that really wants us to know the deep power of listening, like at Sinai. It just seems Kol Hashem just repeats over and over again. And I think it's got a lot of echoes for some of the greatest spiritual moments in our tradition.
Really beautiful.
Yeah, great connection.
That's like a light board and intertextual, like threading that like that.
Yeah, beautiful. I was also thinking about Abraham in a different context, in terms of Lech Lecha. And it seems like, Abraham's the one who leaves his family, leaves everything behind. He's the independent one, right? He's the one who disconnects from his family to connect to God. On the other hand, if you read the text carefully, you see that his father Terach started the journey that Abraham only continued. So there's this kind of paradox between dependence and autonomy. It's almost like a hidden dependence on his father, fulfilling his father's journey to go to the promised land.
But there's also a way in which all of them are listening to the voice. The voice is inside them, guiding them.
Yeah.
I think that's something that these verses really want us to get, that it's easy to think of some external voice on Sinai, but it's really everybody was standing there receiving it in their own voice inside of them. And I know I always talk about psycho-spiritual interpretations, but I can't help it.
I think there's that tension, like the external voice and how we hear that internally and how we each hear that in a very distinctive way that the tradition so beautifully articulates about those moments at Sinai, right? Everyone heard the voice differently.
Yeah, beautiful.
Okay, so there's,
Yeah,
Well,
Thomas, yeah.
I was just going to say that in the discourse of dependency and autonomy, to your question of heeding and listening, there's an interesting paradox, because if I say to you, listen to me, feed you, on one hand, I'm telling you what to do and denying your autonomy. But on the other hand, the very action of asking you to listen to me assumes your own agency in that event. Because I'm assuming that you're capable of directing your attention, your senses, your cognition, your emotion. And so it's simultaneously constrained and liberated, all in the same speech act.
And even the fact that you want someone else to listen to you states your dependency.
Right, the speaker.
Right, the command itself, right? And God's commanding of us shows God's dependence on us.
Right.
So you're right, it's all full of contradiction.
Zora Atkins, Rabbi Zora Atkins, who's a member of our community, former board member Angie Atkins, and son Rabbi Zora Atkins has a beautiful weekly commentary on the Parsha, and he sent out something beautiful this week about this what he called like the mutual dependence between God and the Israelites, and he said like he was comparing idolatry and monotheism, and why monotheism seems to be win the day, and one or in the Torah wins the day, and kind of. There is, of course, Jan Assman and others have written about how polytheism is more clearly more pluralistic and it seems more tolerant. But he was arguing that it's the analog of a hookup culture, theologically speaking. Like, you can move from one God to another. You can just hook up with this God, and this God doesn't answer your prayer. You have another God to go to until you find the God that's the right God for you. But monotheism is a kind of mutual commitment from each party, as it were. And he said it beautifully. He's reading very carefully. He's reading the tradition, where the tradition says that we wear tefillin, which are the phylacteries, and in our tefillin it says, "Hear, O Israel, Lord our God, Lord is one," or "Our God is the one God," or "Shema Yisrael." But the Talmud then goes on to radically assert that God also wears tefillin, and then the Talmud says, "Well, what's in God's tefillin?" And it says, "Mika amcha Yisrael goy echad ba'aretz." And God says, talks about like how special we are. Then God says, like, you're my unique people. Like, I'm trying it out with you, right?
We're special and one.
Right? But like, you're my one.
Yeah, you're
my one. I'm trying out what it is to be a God that doesn't let go of you to find another people, the way that you're not letting go of one God to find another God. Mm-hmm. And so Zohar said it, Rabbi Atkins said it very beautifully, and it kind of points to this a theology of mutual dependency, as it were. And that's underscored by the word Shema, like saying listen means like I need you to listen. And if you don't listen, then I feel like I haven't been heard. And that's really remarkable. A lot of the way that we understand God is God saying, if you just would listen to me, why aren't you listening to me? No one's listening, right? And we often know, it's like, yeah, exactly.
God needs B'nai Israel to be God. In
order for God to be God, as it were, in a theological, right, exactly. Right, it's kind of Jessica Benjamin had this theory called a book she wrote called Bonds of Love, where she talked about intersubjectivity. Yeah, I remember that. So intersubjectivity replaced the notion that the mother was the one who shone light onto the child. The child kind of was just receiving, and it was that both mother and child, like Buber's I thou, appear, they co-arise in an intersubjective embrace. And God says real relationship means that we co-arise and we depend on each other. So it's very beautiful that you brought that out. Oh, yeah.
No, I just wanted to.
Can you all hear? Can you all hear?
Yeah.
Okay.
The word forget keeps coming up in this text. I'm just looking at a grammatical aspect of it quickly. And I just want this phrase, V'haya im shachach tishkolach, and I don't know, like, whereas the English says, if you do forget, you'll go. And I just wondered if you could comment on that grammatical structure, because I found it really interesting.
Wait, which verse?
Shachach tishkach?
Yeah. In shachach tishkach. Meaning, if you do forget, you'll go. That's the first thing. The second thing, I just wanted to 10, 19.
Yeah, tishkach.
Say the same thing.
Well, there's certainly that doubling there,
Yeah,
right?
the
I don't really have a lot to say about it. I hope so.
Okay.
It seems, again, and I think that Asher Chaim also, you pointed this out, that there are times in these texts and also in last week's text where the imperative is used, almost the predictive, right? And the sense that it's almost inevitable, right? And so shachach tishkach here is reminiscent of other doublings of verbs, which almost seem to be the repetition for emphasis says that it's almost inevitable. And it will be when you will certainly forget, right? In shachach tishkach,
Right,
like,
that
you know,
inevitability.
there's a certain quality here.
Yes.
And that's, I think Moses as a teacher also goes back and forth between predicting, you know, both warning against things, but also yet at the same time almost despairing that his warnings will actually be heeded himself, right? Moshe and God both have a problem with speech being heard, it would seem, and almost like, yeah, it's a very powerful point. We talked about it last week that Moses tells the people, do all these things lest you be exiled. But when you're exiled, you know, it's like, really? Wow.
Well, I feel like in this passage and throughout Deuteronomy, Moshe is really naming this this doubleness of experience, right? The profound negative and profound positive, the blessing and the curse, and struggling to hold it all, right? And hold it all for us because we will be there. You know, hopefully we will be in the blessing, but we're also going to forget. We're also going to be in exile. So I think it's sort of a gift that he names all the experience, because when we're there, we can look back and say, oh yes, we're in exile, and Moshe knew it. But there's something about that that's comforting and a consolation. It's like, oh, this is part of the whole package.
It's a great expression of unconditional love, because it says, please don't fail me, you're gonna fail me.
Exactly. And I'm gonna be in relationship to you even when you fail me.
Yeah,
yes,
the
exactly.
relationship is not broken by the anticipation of failure.
Yes, nice.
That again, yeah, it's a beautiful.
I'm just
What's that going to say, Paul?
We were allowed to enter the promised land.
Right.
We
Despite everything.
definitively we failed the central mission, which is to acknowledge the power of God. Over and over and over again, we failed to do that. And yet, still we're allowed to enter the promised land. Gratitude, we never know that. What is it to me that want, to my mind, here what? Show gratitude. It's not you, it's me. Or it's some combination of you and me. But centrally it's me. I'm the guy. I'm the guy.
Right.
Wait, you as man or you as God?
That's
You as
God.
God.
That's God.
God is responsible.
Right, but we might learn again, like the way Thomas just said this, and in general, I think that Rabbi Colorado says, and also I'm watching the chat here, like we might just say that the text is teaching us that even though we will fail over and over again to remember the most important lesson, that the school doesn't shut down. Like we're in the relationship, right? I see Margot writing about chosenness. Like the whole notion of commitment here without getting into chosenness and making ourselves special, but to some degree, our path is a path where we're committed to the uniqueness of this particular path and a particular way of arriving at a place that many others will arrive in their path. And the power of that commitment and coming back to it over and over again, whether it's right, the human spirit, or whatever, you know, our potential has never been erased. And so we get a shot, just like we take birth over and over again in reincarnation in Hinduism or Buddhism, we get another shot to finish what we haven't finished. And God doesn't say, you know, I'm done with you, although in the Torah he wants to at different moments, but Moses fights that impulse. We know that impulse too, like to leave and go find another job or another person.
Never.
I never have that.
But the way Moses fights that impulse
Yeah.
is to say, if you abandon us, everyone else will know that you failed. It's an admission of your failure. And you don't want to do that.
For history, what kind of God abandons a people? And so Moses gets to educate, and that's the great lesson for us, is that we get to be a part of unpacking God's. I know that Frank Bruno doesn't like the unpacking anymore, but unpacking God's potential as a true God. Right? The Torah is a description of human beings' ability to help God become a better God. That's a pretty radical theology, and that's a pretty big task. So don't abandon it. Like keep working on. God needs us, as Heschel said. We have a Baal Shem Tov text that we want to get to and some other things.
Yeah, let's get to that.
Also,
at one point while you do that.
Awesome. No, right.
Which is, remember that Moshe is an old man here, and he's an old man who's trying to give a gift to his people, even though it's a difficult gift. And there's something about wisdom, which I think relates to mindfulness, that Moshe can now see and hold the whole thing, right? The blessing, the curse, the exile, home, the whole thing. And that's what we will, what he says in his speech, we will live out for centuries, which we're still living out. Okay, I love this Baal Shem Tov here.
Okay, y'all see that? We are in source number 2.
No, sorry, here.
So the Baal Shem Tov says, we're not yet at what the Baal Shem Tov says, but you'll get to the Baal Shem Tov part on the bottom, but he's going to quote an early source from Moshe Mikutzi. It's source number 2, or there are no source numbers. Okay, it's right after.
It's right after the Torah source.
Right after the Torah sources that we just read. So it says, Ram Levavcha, he quotes the verse that we just read, that your heart will become haughty, as Asher Chaim said beautifully. Ram here means like Romemu, to elevate, to be like, full of hot air. You rose up. Ram Levavcha, and your heart will be Ram, it will be haughty, and you'll forget God. Amruba Gemara, the Talmud teaches, Azhara, the Gasei Ruach. This is a warning to those who are in Talmudic parlance. Gasei Ruach, mean like cloudy, like are full of wind, right? Hot wind. Gasei Ruach. Ichsiv v'ram levavcha. The Talmud teaches that this is an actual warning, meaning like it's a lav, it's a prohibition against being too haughty, because it will lead to forgetfulness. And the Rav Maharam Mikutzi, Moshe Mikutzi, actually included this in his minyan mitzvot, and is counting up the different mitzvot, like what to do and what not to do. This is a lotase. Don't become haughty, right? As if to say that's enough, but like just don't. Okay, don't. The Chatav Asher Niglu Elav, and this is a great thing. Says, and he wrote Asher Niglu Elav Elohim, that God appeared to him b'chalom halayla, in a dream at night, and told him Ikar Hazarat, Kol Torah, that it's not just a warning, right? A specific warning, don't be haughty, but the essence of the Torah's prohibitions, like the most important warning in the Torah is the warning to remember. And v'ahefech, and the opposite, the destruction of the Torah, what he calls acharisuta Torah, chas v'shalom, the destruction of the Torah, God forbid, is in forgetting. Hu hashichicha, hu bi'er hu Rabbeinu Baal Shem Tov, the Baal Shem Tov said, and this is like someone writing in the Baal Shem Tov, who said about this, Uchemoshu b'pratliut, Adam echad kachu b'chlalut. He says, just as it is true for about one person, do not forget, remember, which is a kind of individual exile when you forget, right, who you are, forget where you belong. So too in the general, that the exile that they were in, right, was extended, right, but its duration extended because of forgetfulness, and through remembrance we will be redeemed. Like that, I want to write like those 3 words. From remembrance, redemption arrives, right? Very Freudian, right? Very pre-Freudian, like it is the unconscious, right, that drives most of our lives, but making the unconscious conscious, or as he would say, making the it into I, somehow to make of that which has been exiled to the, in culture, in nature, read it any way you want. Strong, right?
Yeah, it's very powerful. Very powerful. Yeah, and the question for me is what what do we need to remember? You know, I'm going to teach a little bit during services, or we're going to teach a little bit during services about forgetting and remembering. And David Grossman, the contemporary Israeli writer, says, you know, if you remember too much, you can't stand. You need to forget some things in order to live, in order to like get up in the morning. Like, so what do we need to remember in order to be redeemed? What do we need to remember? And I wonder if the answer is in the first passage, which is we need to remember our dependence. And I was also thinking about, we were talking a little bit about the punishment of karet, which is like one of the worst punishments in Judaism, is if you do certain sins, you're going to be cut off. So if the worst punishment in Judaism is to be cut off, then maybe redemption is to be connected. And
to remember.
To remember. And what memory does is, or what we need to remember is to remember that we're connected to each other and to God.
To dismember is.
Exactly.
To dismember. Wow, nice.
Right,
Nice.
remember.
Now, what have I forgotten today?
Right.
I was saying.
Right. What day is it?
I always remember that the Baal Shem Tov said that forgetfulness leads to exile, while remembrance is the source of redemption.
Yeah.
Found it right here. In
Right.
other words,
You didn't make that up. You remembered that well. That was, you got that.
It was the share.
It was shared. So Kathy Lynn wrote that the worst part of life is to be cut off from oneself and from others and from God, to remember and to reorganize and to realign. And that's really the truth, right? The word religion is from ligamenting. I say this frequently. I remember hearing it from at Paul Mason and amazing Olivia Mason's bat mitzvah from one of the preachers there. Such a beautiful idea that ligamenting is to reattach. Religion's original, right, meaning is to reattach. To what? To what Kathy Lynn said, to God, to people, to ourselves, to want to are some people who it's up to you.
Sure.
Okay, well, Daniel, do you want to speak, and then we have
Well, yeah, I'm going off on a little slightly different tack, which is there's a lot of emphasis here on listening. So we are human beings. We have 5 senses, right? And here is on listening, also as heeding and so on. And I can't help thinking, and perhaps I'm getting ahead of myself for next week's parasha, which is re'eh, to see. So there's also an appeal to another sense. So I was wondering,
Wow, nice.
what we can learn from that, or whether those two make up a whole that's saying you gotta be whole in your commitment, not just listening, but also seeing. Anyway, those just thoughts that I thought might bring up. Perhaps we can discuss that next week.
Well, you know, the retelling of the Sinai experience in Exodus focuses on seeing, and in Deuteronomy focuses on hearing. That's really interesting. And Deuteronomy is the gateway to orality, right? So Moshe is like the human voice. Like we move from the 4 books of the Torah, which are told in the omniscient narrator's voice, and we move into the human voice in the book of Deuteronomy. And from the book of Deuteronomy is sort of the gateway ultimately to the Mishnah and to the Talmud and to, like, you know, the oral Torah. So seeing is included, but I think the orality of this book is really central to, you know, which mode of Judaism sort of takes primary expression going forward.
yeah, there's a whole philosophy. Rav Kook was whose name means to look. Rav Kook is Re'eh, to see, and the acronym of Rav Kook's name was Rabbi Abraham Isaac Kook, which formed the word Re'iyah. Rabbi Avram Yitzhak HaKohen, Reish Aleph Yud Hey, Re'eh, to see. And everything he wrote was about light, or all of his books were about light. He was connected to Rabbi Meir of the Talmudic period in a very profound way. But his student, Rabbi David Cohen, who was his principal student and was known as the Nazarite, the Nazir, wrote a book called Kol HaNivuah, the Voice of Prophecy, and he actually claimed, and this is arguably, inaccurate, whatever it might be, but he argued that the Jewish tradition has given the world what he called a machshava oznit, the ear philosophy, and he wanted to argue that Judaism bases a much stronger emphasis on listening as a function than on seeing as a sense perception, and as a metaphor for the kind of integration. It would be more integrative, because presumably, whatever his understanding of listening has more to do with a much more passive posture. You can't close your ears, but you can close your eyes. And there's something about it that is required, in order to not hear something, requires.
But there's a difference between hearing and listening, right?
Exactly.
So we can close our ears in that sense.
Right, which is much more in the. Right, more in the realm of the internal, exactly. So anyway, there's more about that, but I think that you make a good point, Daniel, about that emphasis here in the book of Dvarim, and I like what you said. It becomes like a into the oral Torah. Dvarim is kind of like the doorway into
prophecy,
the prophecy, into the oral Torah.
The human voice.
The human voice is really profoundly important there. I think we need to go to. We have no time.
No time.
We have time for Yehuda Amichai. So I think this last source.
Yeah.
You want to read it?
So the reason we included this source, Yehuda Amichai, where's the image over there on the screen? Okay. I have it here. We were discussing this morning, Rabbi Ingber and I, and Rabbi Sharon Konanisfeld, like this very difficult passage, and how Deuteronomy can be the presentation of God is often punitive, and how difficult that is. And we're like, oh, I like this line, but I don't like this line. And then we were saying, like, if only we could sort of excise certain lines, the Torah would be much better. And then what came to mind was this great poem. So I'll read it in English, and you have the Hebrew right there. From the book of Esther, I filtered the sediment of, it's the last text on the page.
That's from the
Yeah.
Yeah.
But there is no one.
Of vulgar joy, and from the book of Jeremiah, the howl of pain in the guts, and from the Song of Songs, the endless search for love, and from the book of Genesis, the dreams and pain, and from Ecclesiastes, the despair, and from the book of Job. This is a new stanza here. And with what was left, I pasted myself a new Bible. And now I live censored and pasted and limited and in peace. A woman asked me last night on the dark street how another woman was who already died before her time, and not in anyone else's time either. Out of a great weariness, I answered, she's fine. She's fine.
Wow.
So to go back to what Rabbi Ingber was quoting before from Rabbi Atkins, just as God struggles with having one people and is often disappointed, and just as we struggle with having one God, we also sometimes are disappointed at having one Torah, right? It feels like limited and disturbing. And yet, through this great conversation that starts from the Torah and going forward, right, we can reframe and re-understand and reinterpret again and again, and stay in connection to this one sort of really awesome, I think, sacred text.
Are you familiar with the Jefferson Bible? The Jefferson Bible in which Thomas Jefferson tried to take out everything that was magic.
Oh, really?
Miraculous.
Yeah.
And he did one that was a rational Bible and one that was purely mystical.
Wow.
And he threw the mystical one away because he was a deist.
Talk about chutzpah.
I know.
See, I wouldn't want the rational Bible. I wouldn't want only the rational Bible.
I want just the magical Bible myself.
Right. A lot of people are in Yehuda Amichai's camp, but Amichai's warning us, just like Moshe's warning us about picking and choosing and not living in like a more full, messy reality. I think that this Rabbi Aviva Richmond from Hadar, another amazing teacher who sends out a weekly parsha. He wrote a very powerful piece this week about what she calls an integrationist theology. And essentially, because in this week's Torah portion, we have a part of the Torah will say, and now what, there's a verse in Deuteronomy that says, now Israel, what does God ask of you in chapter 8, verse 10? Except to fear God and to walk in God's ways, to walk in God's ways. And that becomes the rabbinic building block for ethical imitation of the divine. Certain qualities of the divine are teased out of all of the infinite number of qualities of the divine, mostly ethical qualities like clothing the naked and feeding the hungry and so on. And, watching over the orphans and taking care of the widow. And those become the rabbinic paradigm for human ethical and moral development is to imitate God, what's known in Latin as imitatio Dei. But one of the remarkable things that she points out to is that becomes, if that doesn't include also some of the messier elements of life, then it's not an integrationist theology. She spoke of her own experience, trigger warning here, very intense experience, but she wrote publicly about having to carry, she had twins in her womb and one of them died. And so she had to carry both of those fetuses to full term. One became a living child and one wasn't. And she recognized that in rabbinic parlance, the word for womb, one of the words for womb is a kever, a grave. And that she was simultaneously holding life and death in her own body, in her own anatomy. And she spoke very poignantly and powerfully about what it is to be someone who's committed to an integrationist theology, is that you are committed to both remembrance and forgetting, to exile and redemption, to remembering and then being disconnected, and it's all part of it. So it's messy. The Torah, the God of the Torah is not always the God we want and the religion that we want and so on. And we wish we could just, I'll just take this part and, like Jews, when they order from the menu, I'll take that on the side, right? I'll have I worked in restaurants for a long time, so I'll have the falafel with everything on the side, right? Everything on the side. So it's not always that. There's not. There's something to be warned. I mean, that's what Amichai is essentially saying. It's she's fine. She's fine. That's not an integrationist theology, and
it's depleted.
And it depletes. Yeah. It's certainly not, I think, what the rabbis were envisioning. So anyway, Akev. Satisfaction is not guaranteed. So unless you eat and be satisfied and then forget about the source of life, and the Torah says you will, but try your best to remember if you can,
Which is one reason to go to shul.
Exactly. And
This is where we're going now.
So we're going to leave all of you here in the Zoom room with your Zoom moderators. Thank you to Grace and to all of you here. There's plenty of babka to take, and we're going to pick up more conversation at around 11:30 in our open app, 11:40 in our open app this morning. Okay, everybody, Shabbos.
Thank you, rabbis.